Welcome to the Inclusive Growth Show with Toby Mildon. Future-proofing your business by creating a diverse workplace.
Hey there, thank you ever so much for tuning into this episode of the Inclusive Growth Podcast. I'm Toby Mildon, and today I'm rejoined by Poornima Luthra, who is actually based in Denmark, over in Copenhagen. She is an associate professor at the Copenhagen Business School, and I'm based in the UK. So it's good to catch up with Poornima over in Denmark. Poornima has been on the show before, where we had a fantastic conversation, and this is a follow-up conversation. And today we're really going to be talking about the state of EDI, particularly with what's happening in the world and some of the policies that are coming out of the White House as well, and how that's affecting the work that we do. So, Poornima, thanks ever so much for joining me. It's lovely to see you again.
Likewise, Toby. Really glad to be here.
So could you just share with us a bit more about your journey and what led you to specializing in EDI within the corporate sector?
Yeah, thanks, Toby, for that question. I think I guess everyone has personal reasons for why they engage with this work. And there's also, for me, also the professional side. So I'll start off with the professional side of this. I became exposed to the theoretical perspectives around EDI work and the research around it during my PhD program, which was about, 18 years ago, and really started trying to understand what was done in research, looking into gender and feminist theories, looking into the work of Kimberly Crenshaw on intersectionality, queer theory, and really that's really where it comes from. And then, of course, through my PhD program, I got exposed to research methods, exploring this topic more. And really, it was an early experience on a professional front. Once I started my first full-time job after finishing my PhD, I'd been teaching for a few years at a university, and I'd always taught undergraduate courses up till that point in time. And there was a new master's program that was being launched, and I went to the program director and I said, I'd really like to be considered to teach one of these courses. And that particular course was right up my alley in terms of my research interests, teaching interests. I had really good student evaluations, which are important in academia. And the program director looked at me and said, not until you've got a lot more white hair.
Right.
And there I was, a woman of color, but those were not the two dimensions upon which I was being discriminated upon in that moment. It was apparently just the fact that I was not old enough. I was not of the right age. And so that really got me thinking about expanding how we look at diversity in our organizations, who we're being inclusive to, are our processes and conversations that we're having around this. Are they actually being fair? Are we being inclusive? And so that's really where the work began. We're trying to diversify diversity, really thinking about fairness in our processes, procedures, interactions that we're having in the workplace. So that's very much on the professional front. There's also the personal side, I suppose. And if you ask my parents, they'll tell you that, I've always had an awareness about injustice in the world and that it affected me as a child. And then, of course, life experiences being from an underrepresented group in many different contexts, both in school and later on at university, and then, of course, at work, means that you have that lived experience as well. And you want to change things for others and for generations to come so that they don't have to experience the very same things that we've had to experience. So that's really the motivation for entering this space and really trying to change things in organizations and hopefully then broader society, because I do believe that when we're engaging with people in the corporate environment or even in the public sector that employ the vast majority of people, we are then having that ripple effect into society and communities as well.
So the timing of this episode is really important because we're recording this conversation just at the end of March 2025. And there's a lot of negativity coming out of the White House in America around EDI. What are your reflections on the backlash that we are seeing to EDI that's coming out of the White House and some of Trump's policies?
Yeah, I think if we look at the media, I think it is fair to say that the picture looks rather bleak, right? Every day or every week, at least over the last few weeks, we've heard of organizations that are backtracking on their DEI efforts, their DEI targets. But at the same time, there's also evidence that shows us that there are many organizations who are sticking by their policies, practices, and efforts within the EDI space. And, there is data that shows us that in the US, 7 out of 8 organizations are still continuing the work. And it is likely that many of these organizations are going into what I refer to as stealth mode, under the radar, right? Where on the surface, they may not be openly talking about it. They might have removed things from their website. They might be renaming departments and roles in the organization, but they're actually continuing the work. And, maybe this is what is necessary. I know that the policies and, of course, the executive orders are having a disastrous impact on individuals across different sectors. And I also wonder whether this is maybe that pivot point where the work that we're doing within the EDI space, that we are really having to put the mirror up to ourselves, those of us working in this space, to ask ourselves, have we been doing the right kind of work that actually makes and enabled systemic and cultural change to happen? Or has our efforts up till now been largely performative? And have we also failed in many ways to communicate and get everybody along this journey rather than creating polarization? So I do believe this is an opportunity for us within the community, those of us working in different ways, to actually, really have a think about what we've done and how we are doing this work going forward. And that's how I'm seeing it. Of course, you see a mixed bag. I'm sitting here in Copenhagen, and there are some companies that are vocally and visibly coming out and saying that despite what's happening in the US, we are going to continue our efforts with EDI. And yet there are others that are, changing the language that's being used. Some are reporting differently in their, annual reports. But I still do believe that the vast majority of organizations are holding by their values, and they are going into that stealth or under the radar mode.
Yeah, I think if an organization has already got it stated in their values that they celebrate diversity or they want a culture of respect, then they should stick to those values. I remember a colleague of mine who specializes in helping companies define their values says that it's when an organization is going through difficult times that really tests their values. And that's when they should be really leaning into their values rather than rewriting their values, that where the temptation might be. Based on the research that you've done, why do you think we are seeing such a backlash or negativity around EDI in America?
Yeah. So I've spent the last 2 years really studying the backlash. So while we're seeing perhaps the peak of it right now, backlash to EDI work, the resistance has always been there. You can trace it back to the civil rights movement. And there's always been some degree and varying degrees of backlash and resistance. So I've spent the last 2 years really trying to understand where this backlash comes from. And when we start looking at it, it comes down to some of the research around seeing EDI as a threat. And it could be a threat to our status. It could be a threat to the positions that we've held. It could be a threat to our culture, what we believe should be the culture or what we believe should be societal values, and just our ways of doing things. And when something is a threat, it evokes in us as human beings a set of emotions. Everything from being worried to being anxious to being paranoid to being overwhelmed to feeling insecure, inadequate. And so these emotions, when we look at the research around emotions, comes down to the core human emotion of fear. And that's been my research over the last 2 years, to understand this fear, to really delve into what are people actually fearful of when it comes to EDI. And so my research, which is coming out in my new book, Can I Say That?, which releases in May, really looks at 5 fears that exist when it comes to EDI work. And it starts off with the fear of change itself, that when we are trying to, in our organizations or even society, trying to embrace people who are different from us, who may look different, speak differently, look at life differently, have a different approach to things, it challenges us from what we've been comfortable with, what we've been used to. And so as human beings, we are creatures of comfort. We like things as they are. We don't like uncertainty and change. And so it is this fear of change as the first one. And then there's also the fear of really getting it wrong. Right? What if I say and do the wrong thing? I think for a lot of us, myself included, in the climate that we're in right now, I think many of us are feeling like we're walking around eggshells, that we're being cautious about what we say, how we express ourselves. I just spoke to a journalist earlier today who wanted my comments around what's happening right now with EDI. And even for someone like me who's in this space and who wants to be as authentic and real in terms of what I'm saying, I'm also cautious of the kind of language that I'm using and what I'm saying. So there is this fear of getting it wrong, saying and doing the wrong thing. And then there's also the fear of actually taking actions and the personal consequences of doing so, that if I act and I support EDI efforts, how am I going to be seen? Am I going to be cancelled if I get it wrong? Am I going to be seen as the EDI or DI or woke police when I'm in the room? Or there she comes, she's going to be correcting us now on what we're doing, and we get labeled, perhaps, those of us who are working in this space. And then also the consequences, right? A lot of the work within the EDI space is non-promotable tasks. And for many in organizations, they do the work voluntarily. It is on top of, leading, facilitating ERGs, for example, engaging with leaders on EDI topics is often an add-on because of your personal interest, because it's something that you believe in, but it's not really part of the job description for many people, unless you happen to have a title that has EDI within it. But that's not sufficient. In our organizations, we need lots of individuals, contributors and leaders and managers to be able to step up to this. And that means that a lot of people are doing it on top of. And so if this is not something that is valued in the organization, is seen as something that can be used to enable promotion, that's seen as something that's important, it is a non-promotable task. And that's also a consequence. And then it's also the fear of the discomfort that comes from having these conversations. It is not easy for people to come to terms with things like bias, that we are all indeed biased. It's simply how our brain functions. Not that that should be an excuse in any way, because bias has a profound influence on the decisions that we make and how we interact with other people in a way that favors some and doesn't favor others. So we have to first come to terms with the fact that we are indeed biased, and also with ideas around privilege and the shame and guilt that is often evoked when we talk about privilege. And so there's a discomfort from having these conversations. And then finally, the fifth fear is really about the lack of progress. Right? For many of us, and even those who are not working within the space directly, it almost feels like we're taking 2 steps forward sometimes and 5 steps back. And right now, it can really feel like we're going back in time even. So that fear of a lack of positive impact, positive progress, it can be really demotivating. And it can put a huge emotional, mental burden on those who are trying to do the work. So there are these fears. And as you can see from these fears, it's not just people who are working in the space, but also those who are not directly engaged in EDI work, because there's fear all around.
What you've said, those 5 fears just really resonate with me, because they're exactly what the clients that I work with talk about. So when your book comes out, I'm going to buy it and I'm going to give it to all of my clients, because you've just perfectly encapsulated the concerns that they have about progressing EDI in their organizations.
I'm glad it resonated with you, Toby. And the data is based on multiple different data sets, coming together. And if anything, we see this in a more pronounced way today than even, 5 years ago.
But the thing is, I could write an article on LinkedIn and list those 5 fears because it is what my clients are telling me. But you've got the academic rigor and the research that's behind that. So it just proves that these fears are very real for senior leaders in organizations in particular. I mean, talking of which, I mean, how do you go about addressing resistance from senior leaders or employees in an organization who just view EDI efforts as unnecessary or just overly politically correct or quote unquote woke?
If you're enjoying this episode and looking to boost equity, inclusion and diversity in your organisation, Toby and his team are here to help you. The team specialises in crafting data-driven strategies, developing inclusive leaders, designing fair recruitment processes, and enhancing disability confidence. With a blend of professional expertise and lived experience, we are ready to support you on your journey. Reach out to us through our website at mildon.co.uk. Now, back to the interview with Toby and his guest.
I think one of the things that we have to get better at is communicating what DEI or EDI actually means. I think there are misconceptions around the very idea of what is diversity, what is equity, and what is inclusion. And the way I define it in my new book and in my previous books as well is that diversity is really about valuing differences and uniqueness. And equity is really about fairness, and inclusion is really about that deep sense of belonging. Now, if we define it in this way, I think it's very easy for people to say I'm anti-DEI or I'm anti-woke or to not see the necessity. But if we were to ask people to say, would you be anti-valuing uniqueness and difference? Would you be anti-fairness? And would you be anti-belonging, which, as we know, is a core human need? I think it'll be pretty hard for people to say that I'm anti those things. So in many ways, the acronym in itself allows for people to be anti-EDI or anti-DEI or anti-woke, right? And so that's one aspect, is that we need to get better at communicating what this actually means at its core, and that it is part of the human experience to want to be valued for our differences, to want to feel that the world is fair, that our organizations are fair, and that we feel that deep sense of belonging. If we keep that definition in mind, then it becomes easier for us to convince people. So having those conversations, first of all, and then asking people actually, what is it that they're uncomfortable with? What is it that they're fearful of? When I was doing my research, one of the things that came up as I was interviewing people, across different countries, different levels and organizations, across different industries, one of the things that I noticed was that people were fearful of the word fear itself. And so when we have these conversations, it's also about saying, what is it that you're feeling when you encounter or engage in EDI-related work, right, in your organizations? And what emotions are evoked? And people are more comfortable talking about, it worries me, or I just feel like I don't know enough about it. I feel inadequate, or I feel insecure about my own position. And that opens up for having some of these conversations around the need for us to move away from this zero-sum mentality or binary thinking around EDI. And again, that comes back to what I said earlier, that we've got to do a better job at communicating this, because much of the consequences of having targets and quotas in our organizations is that we've created this us versus them mentality. So if you prioritize women in the organization, that it's somehow at the expense of men. And we have created this zero-sum attitude towards EDI work when it shouldn't be. If EDI work is done right, if it is about systemic and cultural change, it is about leveling the playing field, and it is about making sure that the organization is fair for everybody, and everybody stands to benefit from it. And then it's about having those conversations around, well, what is the value that it adds? And look, I myself have used some of the McKinsey data in the past before, but we know that that data is dodgy. There's enough evidence to show that the financial impact or influence of EDI efforts, there is very little proof, and it cannot be validated or replicated in different contexts. So I think it comes down to looking at some of the other research around this, right? Thinking about when we have people who come together with different perspectives and experiences, what value does it add in terms of decision making? What value does it add in terms of idea generation that then leads to either better decision making or creativity and innovation? What does it add when we have an environment of inclusion where people do feel like they can bring their unique selves, where they feel psychologically safe in that environment, where they feel that deep sense of belonging? People thrive in that environment. And it's not just those from underrepresented groups that thrive. In an inclusive culture, everybody thrives. And everybody feels that deep sense of satisfaction with their jobs. And that, of course, then translates into some wonderful organizational outcomes of lower turnover, higher job satisfaction. And so we need to focus on those benefits, that there's actually a benefit for leaders in the organization because it adds value, that their teams are going to be working better together, that they are going to be achieving some of the high performance that we'd like to see on teams. In today's world, with the rapid changes that are going on, transformation, agility that's required, how do we achieve that? And how do we achieve different ways of doing things than how we've always done it before if we don't have people who are thinking differently, who are approaching things differently because of their backgrounds, because of their skills, because of their experiences? So I think it is about the clarification about what EDI actually is and the awareness building. You know, I know we keep talking about, and when I do work in organizations, like we've spent time on awareness, but I don't know if awareness building ever stops, Toby. I feel like it's something that you have to keep emphasizing, going back on, clarifying, because people are bombarded with so much information around them that it's so easy for us to change our views or be maybe even led down a pathway where we are looking at these things in not the way that it was intended or the way it should be. And so we have to keep clarifying. We have to keep building knowledge and awareness. And then it is really about, asking those questions about what is it that people feel when they are resistant to, when they're, engaging with EDI and they feel that discomfort. Where is it coming from? And having those honest, open conversations, which I don't think we do enough of. There's a lot of vilifying, if you'd like, for lack of a better word, around this, that if you're not on board with it, you must be a bad person. But it's about inviting people to the table and saying, let's have a conversation. Where is this coming from? Hear my point of view. Let's discuss and have a dialogue around this. And then it's about actually emphasizing the value that it adds for everybody, not just for some groups, but for everybody.
Yeah, definitely. I did a project with a consultancy company and I had individual phone calls with all of the directors of the company to understand what their hopes and fears were when it came to EDI. And I codified that into 5 hopes and 5 fears. And then we had a boardroom session where we discussed the fears openly, because they weren't being openly discussed. They were being brushed under the carpet. They weren't having those candid conversations with one another. But over the course of working with them for 12 months, they had a complete mindset shift for the better. So how do we make sure that we ensure that EDI initiatives are not just symbolic, they're not just performative gestures, but are actually systemic in nature and have a real lasting impact on organizational cultures?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think the timing to answer, to be reflecting on this question is also now, because as we see organizations peel away from some of the performative work that's, on their websites or showing up at a particular event or annual event and really moving away from that, this is a great time to be asking ourselves, well, what does that systemic and cultural change really look like, right? And in my last book, Leading Through Bias, I really focus on, with my co-author, really focus on the employee life cycle. And in organizations, that's a great starting point of a process where there's plenty of opportunities, some low-hanging fruit, some that are a bit more resource intensive. But there are easy things that we can put into place, nudges that we can put into place throughout the employee life cycle to be able to ensure that they're actually fair, that that our hiring processes are truly based on competencies, that we are making as much of an effort to be able to not hire from the same groups or places that we've always hired from. And that comes down to thinking about the language that we're using in our job adverts and making sure that it's neutral. It's about casting the net as far and wide as possible so that we're tapping into competent talent, well-qualified talent in spaces and places that we might otherwise not have actually tapped into. It's about thinking about how we design the interview process to be more inclusive, to ensure that we're using structured interview guides so that we're not asking certain candidates certain questions that don't favor them, whereas we're asking other candidates questions in different ways, right, that do favor them. And so it's really about thinking about all of this. And then, of course, when people come into the organization, what opportunities, who's being given opportunities for career progression, who's being given the non-promotable tasks in the organization, the office housework, right? Who is being given the visibility opportunities, thinking about pay equity, thinking about how we do performance management. What competencies are we assessing people on when it comes to performance management? How are we providing feedback? Are we providing consistent career progressing feedback to everybody, or are we actually providing that kind of feedback to some people and different kind of feedback to others? So there's so much that we can do across just the employee life cycle. And of course, a lot of my work also focuses on inclusive design, right? Who are the personas that we're thinking about as we design our products and services? How do we expand upon that to ensure that it's being more inclusive? And that comes from if we even look at it from a purely, yes, it's the right thing to do, but from a purely business sense, the diversity of our customers is something that we want to be able to embrace so that we're reaching a larger segment of the population. And of course, that's good for business, right? And then thinking about marketing campaigns, we all know that, and I'm sure we can all list marketing campaigns that have gone terribly wrong because there wasn't that attention paid to looking at where it could be offensive, it could be discriminatory towards certain groups in the language, in the visual imagery that is being used. And there are plenty of examples that we can come up with. But that also makes us think about, well, were there people from these groups represented within the decision-making bodies across that, marketing campaign cycle? And if they were there, did they feel safe enough to be able to address it, or did they go along with it because their voice was not really heard or had not been heard in the past? So we have so much that we can actually pay attention to that is systemic and that enables that cultural change to happen. And of course, in one of my books that I write, focuses on allyship, right? Thinking about how do we show up to nurture that culture of inclusion by being an ally, by stepping up, not just being passive, but actually showing up, stepping up, and engaging in day-to-day behaviors frequently to be able to ask questions, to challenge each other on our biases in a respectful, empathetic way, to be able to have vulnerable conversations as well. And so nurturing that kind of day-to-day interactions by the coffee machine at lunch during meetings, that's where we see that cultural shift happening. So there's plenty that we can do. And these are the things we should be focusing on rather than those symbolic, on the website, attend an event, have, a panel discussion, and we're done for the year.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that because so many clients come to me saying, we've done all of that. We've changed our logo to the pride flag during LGBT History Month, and we're not seeing the needle shift. And I have a really interesting conversation with them about the systemic changes that are needed. Now, I mean, this is something you touched on a bit earlier, and it's really around about how working in the EDI space can be quite challenging. A lot of people are doing it on the side of their desk. So they might have a day job, and then they might be chairing an employee resource group like a LGBT group or something like that. What's your recommendations on how people working within this space manage their emotional and mental well-being that comes with working in this area, particularly when they're facing pushback or they're really frustrated with the slow progress that's being made?
Yeah. I think self-care is very important, Toby. I think for all of us in this space, I think many of us take it on because we believe it's the right thing to do, that we have had a lived experience ourselves, or we feel that, we want change to happen and we see the value maybe for our teams and organization from a business standpoint. And so we take it on. But at the same time, it comes with a lot of emotional and mental stress and strain. And so for me, self-care is important. And I think we need to allow ourselves the permission to step away when we need to and come back to it. Stepping away doesn't mean we're not as committed, that we don't believe in it. Of course we do. But sometimes it is just too much. And sometimes the burden is very much on folks from underrepresented groups who are already experiencing this in their day-to-day. There might be trauma involved in their experiences that they're living with. And every time they're engaging on this, it reignites that trauma in individuals. And so self-care for me is super important. And stepping away doesn't mean in any way that your commitment to this work is any less. At the same time, I also think that for those of us who have the physical, emotional, mental strength to keep at it for the time being, at least to be resilient and keep at it, we also need to challenge our organizations to say that this work is important. It needs to be valued. It needs to be recognized. It needs to be part of performance reviews. It needs to be seen as something that is a promotable task because it is hugely important in shifting the systems and processes and culture of the organization. So I think it is a combination of both giving ourselves grace and permission to self-care, and when we're feeling strong, when we're feeling like we can, to also challenge the environment around us to ensure that this is something that is truly valued so that it is seen as something important in our organizations.
Well, thanks ever so much for joining me today. I've thoroughly enjoyed catching up with you, and I'd like to get you back on the podcast, perhaps when your next book comes out. Before you go, can you just give us a very quick reminder of what your book is, how people can get their hands on a copy?
Sure, I can do that. So my new book is Can I Say That? Your go-to guide for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that comes out in May. So please do look out for it. Join me on LinkedIn, follow me on LinkedIn. And once the book is out in May 2025, you'll be able to order it on Amazon and all the usual channels. But my previous books are also out there: Leading Through Bias, The Art of Active Allyship, and Diversifying Diversity, which are available through major retailers in the UK, around the world, and of course on Amazon.
Have you got another book inside you, do you think?
Not just yet. I think, Toby, if I write another book, I think my family might... I've written 4 books in 5 years. So that's been quite 5-6 years. So it's been quite an intense pace. So I'm going to take a moment, I think, just to get this one out. And I think it's an important one that addresses fear. So I'm going to just sit with this for a little while, but, never say never, right? So I'm sure there's one more brewing somewhere up in my head, but hopefully sometime soon. Yes. Thanks, Toby.
Yeah. Well, I really enjoy your thought leadership, and I think it'll be good to see another book. I know when I wrote my first book, Inclusive Growth, my publisher said to me, now that you've written one book, you've caught the book bug, and there's probably another book inside you. And then a year later, I published my second book, and now I'm thinking about my third book. So yeah, I think authors do catch the bug.
Oh, absolutely. And it is a beautiful process, right? And, I'm reminded I have Toni Morrison's quotation right here. If there's a book that you want to read, but it hasn't been written yet, then you must write it. I think that's what's always motivated me with all my research and the books that I've published. So waiting for the next inspiration. But thank you for having me, Toby. Always such a pleasure.
You're welcome. Thanks ever so much for joining me today. And thank you for tuning into this episode of the Inclusive Growth Show with myself and Poornima. Hopefully you've taken away some inspiration and some different perspectives on how you can manage EDI within your organization. As always, if you need any support, reach out to me through my website, mildon.co.uk. Please do go and buy a copy of Poornima's book when it comes out. And please do follow her on LinkedIn as well so that you can follow her thought leadership. So thanks for joining me today. And I look forward to seeing you on the next episode, which will be coming out very soon. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the Inclusive Growth Show. For further information and resources from Toby and his team, head on over to our website at mildon.co.uk